Hey, welcome to Adoption Now, the after show. We have just told a great story this week. Jackie from Florida, she is an adult adoptee, and she told us all about what it was like to grow up in a very loving family, but now want to find her birth family. And she is at a roadblock. She cannot find those answers. That podcast was very interesting. Noah and I learned a ton. Noah, did you love that show?
I loved it. I'm fascinated by all the different emotions and feelings they go through and how she was able to suppress that for 2 years, 5 years. Like you go through this huge open possibility and then all of a sudden you hit a blockade. And then for 2 years to wait, I think that's pretty unbelievable.
She probably just got busy because it's not your everyday life to be looking for people, you know? And so you kind of busy yourself, you're in school, and then you wait for another opportunity. One of the questions that we got was, what does it look like to support your children in their search for their birth families? That's hard. You and I are adoptive parents, so we know what that's like to just feel like, we want you to stay with us forever, only us. But there's these other parents that they need to find, and there's these answers they have to find out for their identity. How can we support these children?
I honestly think through all of the stories that we've heard, there's never been a story where a birth parent has suppressed all of that, and it's been a good thing.
It's
right?
true. Mm-hmm.
And so I always remind myself of that, whether it's our own kids or you hear these stories. I would encourage every adoptive family, make sure you keep that line of communication open. You give them the opportunity. It doesn't mean you force it on the kids. Doesn't mean you try to push it, but be ready for those conversations because they're going to come up. And I think what happens is if you don't have them, then you create this tendency for kids to create their own version of their story, which can be so hard. And Jackie even kind of alluded to it, right? She thought that her birth mom was
Mariah Carey.
And that's what these kids, you hear this all the time, right? As kids, they have this like idea of this princess or queen or king of who their birth parents are. And so if you have that open line of communication, I think it helps so much.
I totally agree with that. And I think being supportive when they're younger, when they bring up the conversation, talking to them. And you don't have to make it happen. That's what I do wrong because I'm always like, hey, kids, I want to sit down.
But
you guys are adopted. Do you want to talk about it? And they're like, Mom, why is she so weird? And I have learned, okay, I'm going to let this be more natural and not just be weird. Remember I did that one time and I was like, what are you doing? Cut it.
But at the same time, I would never do it. So it's a good balance because I'd be just like, just don't even talk about it. Who cares, right? So no, it's funny. Sometimes we...
A little over the top. One of the things that Jackie said that I really liked is she said that she accepted being adopted when she was 5. And the reason is because her parents started taking her around other adopted kids and she didn't feel alone and she started to identify. I think that is so, so important. If you are an adoptive family, don't isolate. Find people in your community that you can let your kids play with. And so that your kids can understand that this is in other families. I'm not the only one. That is the struggle with a lot of adoptees, I think, is they feel like I'm the only one. Everybody's looking at me. And so giving them a place where they can identify with other adoptees is super important.
I totally agree.
Okay, another thing I want to say that she mentioned is it is okay to feel a mix of emotions. And we talk about this a lot in adoption, but if you are an adoptee and you feel like I loved my parents, it doesn't mean that you don't have to wonder about your birth family. You can have both. You can be thinking, I love them, but I'm curious, and you can find that support. It's okay for you to find those answers. I just want to say that because sometimes in order to not hurt your adoptive families, adoptees will back up and they won't do anything. And I really don't think that that's the answer.
I think as a man, it's harder to do that too. I think you've always talked about the dichotomy, right? And I think we're men typically, not always, but are typically compartmentalized. So we feel one emotion and that's it. So if you don't feel happy, then it's almost like we won't even allow the other side of that. So I think it's so important. You've taught me so much. And these stories have taught me so much of how you can have both feelings. You don't have to just have one. And yeah, if you don't allow that, I think you can stop a lot of the growth and a lot of the healing that can take place.
Yes. Okay. One last thing to recap. I did like the part of the podcast where she said when she tells people she's adopted, people will often make her feel like she just told them about a terrible disease she has. They don't know what to say. They're like, oh. And the responses that we have are kind of weird because being adopted is not a disease. The way that we should really respond, I think would be the healthiest, is to let the adoptee know that we are there for you. So ask them a question like, oh my gosh, how did you feel about that?
Yes.
And let them respond. And when they say, it was terrible, then you can be like, oh. But if they're like, oh, well, it was my life, you're like, oh, cool. And then you just go on. And that's how you make friends with adoptees. And adoptees are going to say, thank you for saying that. Because I do feel weird when I'm in a new relationship or I get new friends and I'm like, want to tell them, but then I don't want everybody to be feeling sorry for me. You don't have to feel sorry for an adoptee. You just have to talk to them and get to know them. They're just telling you a piece of their life. And that's one thing that she said too. She kept that in a lot in college. And she had very few friends because of that. And I just wouldn't want that for our kids.
No, absolutely not.
Thank you so much for doing this recap with me. And don't forget to subscribe to YouTube. We want you to be a part of our community and see these recaps every single week. Hey, and if you want to hear the full podcast of Jackie's story, you can go to adoptionnow.com. We'll see you next week.